Greetings to all C3RF members and friends across Canada and indeed around the world, and a special welcome to the folks at Veterans for Freedom on their dedicated streaming channels to view this video summary of the C3RF update for 17 May 2024. The title of this update is Hostile, and it kicks off with a reference to a recent C3RF In Hot interview with Dr. Stephen Malthouse, in which he noted that British Columbia's Bill 36, now the Health Professions and Occupations Act, takes direct aim at recalcitrant doctors by punishing their resistance to bureaucratic medical directives with upwards of $500,000 in fines and years in prison. If this wasn't bad enough, the same province, through Bill 31, or its Emergency and Disaster Management Act, has given itself the right to seize your house and property on a whim. One can be forgiven for believing that the whole business of emergency response has become a scam aimed at perpetrating hostile acts against the good citizens of Canada. The whole business of foisting hostile acts on Canadians is not restricted to the province of British Columbia. Indeed, Ontario was quick off the mark after the Federal Emergencies Act was invoked against Freedom Convoy 2022 protesters to initiate its own Bill 100, otherwise known as the Keeping Ontario Act of 2022. This bill authorized the confiscation of vehicles and related licenses and insurance without due process. It would seem that the invocation of the Emergencies Act gave Canada's provincial premiers the courage they needed to thumb their noses at the Charter of Rights and Freedoms that protected their own citizens and which they were sworn to serve. Those who saw the Charter as the bastion of Canadian civil liberties would be very concerned, as it would appear that the emergency-based considerations were all it took to crush it without so much as a whimper. One might argue that the hostile acts engendered by the invocation of the Emergencies Act, including the blanket freezing of protester financial accounts and the follow-on legislation in forms of Bills 36 and 100, were reasonable excursions given the Charter's own limitations section. Individual fundamental rights can be sidelined given demonstrable justification consistent with a free and democratic society. Problem is, a court of law convened by Federal Court Judge Richard Mosley found no such justification when he recently ruled that the invocation of the Emergencies Act was unreasonable and contravened both sections 2B and 8 of the Charter. Regardless, the federal government would double down on its implementation of hostile acts by immediately announcing it would appeal Mosley's decision, even as it left its own Emergencies Act-inspired anti-protester crowdfunding laws in place. In doing so, it proclaimed that the hostile acts it foisted on the public during the Wuhan virus pandemic and beyond were not coincidence. They were intended. Once the mind is open to the possibility that one's own governing agencies view them with hostile intent, it's hard not to see it at every turn. Indeed, when Canadians look back at the actions of their governments over the past 9 years, it is difficult to see any initiative that has proven more beneficial than not. Beginning up front in the 2015 time period, for example, we see the watershed signing of both the United Nations Agenda 2030 and Paris Agreement on climate change. These two agreements, acquiesced to by Conservative and Liberal governments respectively, would serve as a 1-2 combination to Canada's sovereignty, as international solutions and targets on several critical files would become the order of day for Canada. Canadian solutions that took advantage of Canadian capacities, including boundless reserves of clean natural gas energy and CO2-consuming forests. It would be the world's way or the highway. The hostile intent displayed to Canada's national sovereignty through such international giveaways would be replicated at the cultural level as well. Where once Canadians in Canada stood on the world stage as respected and trusted interlopers with a long history of outsized positive contributions, its whole reason for being would be put up for question and ridicule. And so it was with Motion M103 that matter-of-factly claimed that Canada was systemically racist and a religious discriminator, particularly when it came to Islam. There would be no credit given for its tradition of securing individual rights as a precursor to the development of a free and democratic society that would be the envy of the world and an attraction for people from every corner of the planet and from every race, religion, and creed. Canada, after all, was bad. Declarations and shows of hostile intent flowing from leader to citizen would not end with Motion M103. Witness the assertions of genocide as ambiguous ground radar returns near former residential schools were taken to be the remains of Indigenous children. This off-the-wall declaration was issued by none other than Canada's own Prime Minister and is in line with his proclivity to play favourites when dealing with the nation's component parts. Those claiming allegiance to Canada's traditional values of individual rights and the rule of law are pilloried when they rise up against his inane policies, like trucker vaccine mandates. They are set upon with martial law, unlike those who very nearly shut down the national rail sector in the early winter of 2020. In the former case, there was no room for dialogue, while in the latter, it was the best path forward. What's going on? The bias continues to this day as pro-Hamas rallies are allowed to shut down campuses and city centers. After all, they have charter rights to free speech and protest that have eluded our truckers. Interestingly, this phenomena of prejudice against those holding the values that used to underpin our liberal democracy has raised its ugly head across the West. How else to explain the unhindered ability of pro-Hamas elements to threaten and intimidate Jewish populations in downtown Ottawa and throughout the United States and Europe? How is it that calls for ceasefire, take the vaccine, open your borders to illegal migration, arm Ukraine, and build back better all emanate from Western seats of political power repeatedly and in unison? How is it that these same seats of power busy themselves with legislation dedicated to shutting down any opposing views as hateful or disinformation? Are we being gaslit and herded? In Germany, this legislation has taken the form of the Network Enforcement Law of 2017. In the UK, it is the Online Safety Bill of 2023. In Ireland, it is the Incitement to Violence or Hatred and Hate Offences Bill of 2022. In Scotland, it's the Hate Crime and Public Order Act of 2021. And in Canada, it's the draconian Bill C-63 or Online Harms Act. These legal instruments have much in common, including the designation of subjective notions like hate and disinformation and using them as cudgels to smash free speech. Additionally, their institution is only slightly downstream of the invasion of Western jurisdictions by masses of migrants from non-Christian and non-democratic regions. This mass movement of arguably military-aged males had its impetus with the Arab Spring of 2011 and is seen to be fully compliant with the Sustainability Development Goals of the UN's Agenda 2030 and its Global Compact for Safe, Regular, and Orderly Migration. Canada, the good global citizen that it is, has taken mass and reckless migration on as its own first-order priority, even as it operates in opposition to the national and personal interests of Canada and Canadians respectively. The fact that Canada is pursuing interests other than its own and hurting itself in the meantime has become readily obvious in the areas of housing and security. In the former case, the influx of record numbers of migrants has created a demand for housing that is simply untenable given the resources available. In the latter case, we are seeing the results of importing populations that prize tribe over the rule of law and many holding fast to exclusionary and exceptional theocratic or Sharia governance systems. The result has been the restriction of the movement of Jewish students and even professors on Canadian campuses. The whole thing is reminiscent of Canada in the 1930s and 40s when the numbers of these students were controlled. Such hostile acts and intents may serve a globalist agenda, but they hold no weight in Canada unless they can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. Until they are, and in line with Section 52(1) of the Charter, they need to be considered without force or effect. Now to find political representatives who have the royal jelly required to put such understandings forward to the benefit of Canada and Canadians. In closing, a reminder that you can see this update with all of its research links at www.canadiancitizens.org. Simply go to the News tab and pull down to select C3RF member updates to gain access to all related essays. Until next time, this is Russ Cooper signing off and wishing you and yours much happiness and freedom from C3RF.